Hey everyone, Lauren from A Girl and Her Wool here. So instead of being joined by Fibonacci like we normally are, we have a special guest of Pythagoras. So this is my other cat who doesn't often show up in these videos, but here he is today. So we'll see how long he lasts. So today I'm going to be talking about why I started my hand-dyed yarn business. So I'm going to be starting a series over the next however long, where I kind of talk about why I got into the business, how I got into the business, kind of now that I'm a year and a half in, reflecting back on that. I think it'll be interesting over time to have videos like this where things that I think are necessary and important, you know, as somebody starting out, you know, kind of talking about those things, but then over time, you know, how does the business change and what I'm planning to do. So I think that'll be interesting to show over time. So over the next few weeks, I'll just spend some time kind of reflecting again back on the last year and a half of, you know, my experience having a hand-dyed yarn business. My plan is to do this series every other Tuesday, so kind of alternating with the Dye With Me's. So I do post a Dye With Me video every other Tuesday here on my channel. And so these videos are just gonna be the other every other Tuesday. So the Tuesdays will alternate between these two topics for the time being. And then I'll stick to my crafty content on Fridays. So as a kid, I was always pretty crafty in that I did a lot of needle points. So I would work on those all the time in my free time when I was watching TV, or if we were doing a long car ride or visiting people. I always brought needle points with me. And even back then, I remember thinking that someday I wanted to open a needlepoint store. That was always something that I wanted to do. And it was just, that was my hobby at that time when I was growing up. As I got older, and I've talked about this before, but I had to take a series of exams, and so I didn't really have free time during that time. But I did start to grow an interest in knitting, and while I was living in a new city kind of by myself, not really knowing anyone in the city except coworkers, I found myself drawn to the online knitting community. So I found a lot of blogs to read. I was listening to podcasts, watching YouTube videos, and I kind of absorbed myself into that knitting community. And so once my free time kind of opened up and I was able to now have a hobby, that's really when I took to knitting. And because I had spent all this time listening to people talking about all of the projects that they were doing, I kind of just naturally picked everything up. Like, I think I just learned a lot through osmosis of like listening to everything. And so because everybody I was listening to and reading were just always knitting socks, I just knit socks. I followed patterns and everything, but there was no like fear of starting them because that's what everyone did, and so I started to as well. Like, I didn't know I should be afraid to try socks or to try a sweater or anything like that. I've always been a learner as well, so I always loved school. I loved learning. I loved creating schedules and plans and getting things done, and I just always really need something to be working towards. I find it hard to just kind of get stuck in a rut of doing the same thing day in and day out. And so once those exams were done, which kind of, you know, even though I was working full time, I was still studying and learning, that kind of gear shifted into knitting. And so I became really interested in learning a lot about knitting. And so that's like where I was challenging myself and finding myself doing all of these things to keep learning. There's just so much to learn out there between knitting different types of things, so socks versus sweaters, but then there's also learning about different kinds of wool or different stitches or different techniques, all of that. There's tons to learn with knitting, and so that kind of kept me intrigued and interested and challenged for quite a few years. But then I think I kind of stabilized in my knitting. I was able to knit socks without patterns, and I could just pick it up and go. I had my favorite techniques that I like to use. I had knit a few sweaters, I had made shawls, so by no means did I like conquer knitting, but I felt like I was on autopilot with a lot of knitting that I had. And I was still excited to knit all the time, but it was no longer feeling that like I need to challenge myself and I need to continue learning. And so my eyes started wandering, and I think that just then shifted into yarn dyeing. And so I started watching a lot of videos about how yarn is dyed. I think like a lot of people, when I was working up with yarn, I would kind of think about how, how did they do this? Like, how did speckling work? How did the color kind of stay in one place? And I would ask those questions as well. And I would think in my mind about how it worked. And I don't think I really understood early on that a lot of the hand-dyed yarns were done by one person hand dyeing these yarns. I guess at some point early on, I assumed it was still all machines and they somehow knew how to get the yarn on there. And so when I did start kind of learning and figuring out how all that worked, it became a new thing to learn and to challenge myself with. And so I kind of shifted into dyeing. So for a few years of knowing what yarn dyeing was and kind of following yarn dyers online, I always had like a pinch of jealousy in terms of them getting to run their own business this way, doing something that they loved, challenging themselves with a business, and being self-employed, working from home, and all of those things we glorify a lot of it with, without necessarily knowing everything that went into it. So of course, when you have a business, you're doing more than just the craft. And that was something that I considered a lot before starting my business. But I still was interested in seeing what yarn dyeing was about just on its own without thinking about the business side of it. So I did pick up, so I was up late one night. We did a day trip to visit a friend of mine who lives a couple of hours away, and we just did it all in one day. And so before driving home, I did drink a lot of coffee, and so I was up a little late that night, and so I was just kind of scrolling through Amazon, picking out things that if I were to try dyeing, what would I need? And lo and behold, I purchased them. Not that night, I thought about it for a few days, and I ended up trying out dyeing. So when I first was doing that, I was dyeing up minis in these little pans using, I think, like a sampler set of dye, either through Knit Picks or maybe even Amazon, but I think Knit Picks. I think I got a sampler of dyes from them along with some of their bare wool, and I just wound off little bits of it to make little minis. And so I just tried around with that, and I just fell in love with it right away. I was so excited. I carried those minis around with me, 30-something-year-old grown-up, carrying around little minis. I left them on my desk at work so I could stare at them all day. I loved it. I thought it was so cool that I had dyed yarn, and I had done some that were some more variegated ones, and so finally I figured out how to dye yarn where the color kind of stays. And the questions that I had been asking for all those years in my head, I had actually done it, and so I was really excited about it, and then couldn't stop. I started dyeing up quite a lot of minis, and if you see, well, I think it's in that bag, maybe not, but I have a whole bunch of minis. If you guys are following along, you know I'm knitting a northeasterly blanket, and that's all using these test minis that I did when I was figuring out dyeing and just learning it and having fun with it right at the beginning. And so that's what I did. I dyed up minis. I tried all different colors. I ended up buying some more dyes so I can continue playing with it, mixing them, just testing them all out, and had a blast doing it. So at that point, deciding to open up a business became more and more transparent. Again, it was something that I was interested in, and I was, to be honest, looking for a way that I could bring in additional income that could help me manage my own yarn buying budget. So I figured that whatever money I brought in from this business would go into my yarn budget, and that would basically make it where I could spend money on yarn as I wanted to out of this budget without really hitting like our personal finances or anything like that. And so that was my plan. My plan was to sell the yarn enough to, I had a few goals at first, which I'll talk about later, but I kind of went into it with that mindset, was that I wanted to start this business simply to help me afford a yarn buying hobby, I guess. I knew going into opening up a business for hand dyeing yarn, it wouldn't just be about hand dyeing yarn. And so part of my why I opened it also had to be about wanting to open a business. And this is something, again, as a kid, I even said I wanted to open a needlepoint store, or, you know, as I got older, I guess a yarn store or something like that. But with the shift to so much online e-commerce and everything like that, I liked the idea of having an online shop. I thought that would be really fun. Again, always was interested in seeing the lives of the people who were able to create businesses from home and keep them running out of their home. I always thought that would be really cool, and just having a business of my own that I could continually be working on and continually be challenging myself, I thought was really interesting. I really also think that with businesses, going back to me always wanting to learn and challenge myself, I felt like with businesses, you always have to stay on top of what's changing, what's new, and what's coming. And so it seemed like you would never fall into that rut. And maybe that's true or not. Again, this is me from the perspective of having this for a year and a half at this point. But at this, you know, where I am now, it is still constantly a learning experience and a challenge. I also remember, and this was like, had nothing to do with me opening up a business, but I remember at some point, my cousin said something like, a baker stops being a baker once they own a bakery. Like, once you kind of own your own business, you aren't that person anymore. You're now a business owner. So that was something that always was in my mind too, was if I were to open a yarn business, my day-to-day life wouldn't be about the yarn. It would be about running a business. And so that was something that I had to be okay with. And again, that was something that I was interested in too. So I did like the craft of yarn dyeing, but I really also wanted to own my own business. By opening up my yarn business, I kind of was hitting on my, you know, wanting to continue to learn and challenge myself, wanting to be a business owner and have that I was working towards, and then also just be doing it in a community that I've grown to really enjoy, and that being the yarn and fiber community. So on the next video, I'm going to be talking more about how. So now that I kind of made that decision about opening it, how did I go about it? What did I do? So all that will be in the video 2 weeks from today. So I hope you join me. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. And make sure you comment below with kind of what's your why do you craft? If it's just because it's a hobby, I'd love to hear that. But if there's anything more, or how do you challenge yourself in your day-to-day life, I'd love to hear more about that. And on Friday, I will be talking about my current knitting project. I'd love to give you guys an update on all of that. So join me then, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.